Ukraine is a vast country with many famous places. But how do you pronounce these cities and regions in Ukrainian? And how should we pronounce them in English? Let's explore that together. I'm Luke, and this is Plymothy. Let's start in the Ukrainian region of Crimea. The English name Crimea comes from the Italian Crimea, spelled the same, and this is from the Crimean Tatar language, Krim, and comes into Ukrainian as Krim. Well then why don't we call it Krim? As is true for many place names, the English name Crimea is not derived directly from the modern language of the land. In this case, it's an alteration of the Italian Crimea, which has the added Latinate suffix -a, from Latin aia, that's the restored classical pronunciation, and that's an adjectival suffix. Thus something like terra or regio Crimea in restored classical pronunciation, or Reggio Crimea in the ecclesiastical pronunciation. Going from Crimea to Crimea is actually pretty common in English. Just compare the Italian word idea with the English word idea. It's the same kind of change. Now, I don't recommend accenting the first syllable as some do, so not Crimea, but Crimea. Also, there's no need to say the Crimea. It's unnecessary. It's just Crimea, a region in Ukraine. Crimea has a well-known city, often called Sevastopol in English. Now, there are other cities in Ukraine with this pol suffix, derived from the ancient Greek word polis, meaning city. And these names were made in honor of the ancient Greek colonists who founded various places in what is now southern Ukraine. This same suffix is found in the names of many cities from antiquity, like Neapolis, for Naples, and Konstantinopolis, or in ancient Greek, Konstantinoupolis, Constantinople. In Ukrainian, these cities are Sevastopol, Mariupol, Melitopol. In all three, the stress accent falls on the vowel before the pol suffix. Now, while I understand that English speakers might find Mariupol, Melitopol, and Sevastopol more euphonous with the patterns of English speech, I nevertheless recommend placing the accent on the same syllable as in Ukrainian. So I call these cities Sevastopol, Mariupol, Melitopol, and that way they also sound like Constantinople. Crimea is also home to a place descended directly from ancient Greek colonists, called Chersonisos in modern Greek, Chersonesos in the Pompeian Lucian pronunciation, and Khersonesos in classical Attic pronunciation, which means dry island. From this comes the Ukrainian name, Khersones. It lends its name to the region to the north of Crimea, Kherson. By the way, to any of the Ukrainians who may be watching, if I get any of the Ukrainian names incorrect in this video, do let me know in the comments. Дякую. So Kherson starts with a consonant sound that we don't have in most forms of modern English, which is h, and can be heard in Spanish jefe, German Bach, and modern Greek charti. Now, one way to render this sound in English is with the sound of h, but I don't recommend that for Ukrainian terms in English, for a couple reasons. One is that the ch sound of Slavic languages is regularly rendered as a k in English, and we do the same for German names, like Bach in German, well, we call him Bach. And the other is that Ukrainian already has a letter for the H sound. It's this one. So, should we say Kherson, Kherson, or Kherson? Now, as you know, I'm a native speaker of American English, so if you use a different English pronunciation, you'll have to modify this accordingly. Now, there are three vowel sounds in American English that we might use, such as the words cot, caught, and coat. In British English, they're caught, coat, coat. Some people, though, have the cot-caught merger, where the first two sound the same. Now, Ukrainian doesn't really have this three-way distinction phonemically, only phonetically in some situations. So, really, any of these three sounds we use in stressed syllables, a, o, could work. Kherson, Kherson, Kherson. When we have an R sound before an E sound in English, we tend to want to reduce that vowel. Thus, instead of Kherson, saying Kherson is more natural for us. Now, some people switch the accent to the first syllable and they say Kherson or even Kherson. but I think it's best to retain the accent on the original syllable wherever English phonetics may allow. Thus, Kherson, Kherson, or Kherson in general American pronunciation. In British English, it would be Kherson, Kherson, Kherson. The Ukrainian word for region, oblast, is frequently borrowed into English when discussing Ukrainian geography, and we call it an oblast or an oblast. Well, which one is it? You see that final letter in the Ukrainian spelling? That's what's called a soft sign, and it has the effect of palatalizing the preceding consonants, and that means it adds a simultaneous y sound to them. And this has the effect of making the preceding vowel sound a little bit higher or more fronted. So when we hear the Ukrainian word, we're not sure if it sounds like a or ah. And for this reason, both oblast and oblast sound reasonable to me. The capital city of Kherson Oblast is also called Kherson, and the fourth largest river in Europe flows through it, starting in Russia, going through Belarus, before flowing through Ukraine. In English, the traditional name for the river is Dnipro or Dnipro, which is derived from the Russian name for it, Dnipro. English derives quite a few place names in Eastern Europe from Russian, due to the influence Russian language and culture once had around the world. But as the prestige of Ukraine has increased, and as Ukrainian place names have become renowned across the globe, most English speakers name the river Dnipro or Dnipro, from Ukrainian Dnipro. There's also a city called Dnipro. On the left bank of the Dnipro, near the regional capital of Kherson, is a port city called Kakhovka. Here again, we have the ch, which I'm recommending be rendered as k in English. But we also have the Ukrainian letter that we write as a V. Now, this very special letter can have more than one pronunciation in Ukrainian, depending on the speaker, the letter's position in a word, and several other factors. Or rather, we perceive this allophonic variation as different sounds when it just sounds like the same thing to a Ukrainian. Now, these sounds range from w, v, v, v to v. For simplicity, it's regularly rendered as v in English, a V sound. So you can pronounce the city's name rather simply as Kakhovka or Kakhovka. The city we saw earlier, called Melitopol, from the Greek roots for honey city, is located in this region, Zaporizhzhia. The digraph ZH is how we transliterate the Slavic consonant sound zh. It's equivalent to the sound in our words azure and equation. But why are there two of these digraphs ZH in the English spelling? Well, that's because the consonant sound is geminated in Ukrainian. Zaporizhzhia. You'll also notice this letter I, sometimes written with the letter Y, after the digraphs. You can just ignore it, it's for palatalization. In English, this region and its capital are pronounced Zaporizhzhia. 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 One more time, just to make sure you got it. Repeat after me. Zaporizhzhia. And the city of Zaporizhzhia is the capital of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. The city Mariupol from before is in the region Donetsk, and there's also a city there by the same name. In English, we say Donetsk. Adjacent to Donetsk Oblast is the region Luhansk. Note here, this letter sounds pretty close or identical to the English letter H, Luhansk. Thus in English, this region of Ukraine and its major city are called Luhansk. Together, Luhansk and Donetsk form an important economic region in eastern Ukraine called Donetsk Volhyny Basin, Donetsk Coal Basin, Donbas for short. In English, Donbas, Donbas, or Donbas all work, with the stress accent on the final syllable. A famous city here is Bakhmut. I think the best way to pronounce this in English is Bakhmut. Note that the characteristics of Ukrainian stress accent, including its usual pitch component, often confuse an English speaker, since Bakhmut can sound like it's accented on the first syllable to our ears. But it's really not. Bakhmut, Bakhmut are two ways you could hear the same name, and it's still stressed on the final syllable, hence Bakhmut. Another well-known city in this area is Lyman. Note the letter Y. When transcribing Ukrainian into the Roman alphabet, the letter Y has two functions. One of them is to represent the sound Y, like in the word yes. The port city Berdyansk, or Berdyansk is one such example. The other function of letter Y in transliterations is to represent the vowel sound I, much like in our word hit or pin, and that's how it's used in Lyman. Thus, in English, we pronounce this as Lyman, not Lyman. Lyman. In some names, this I pronunciation provides quite a challenge for us. Places like Sumy. We ought to say Sumy, but English doesn't end words with the vowel phoneme I, so a more natural English rendition would be Sumy instead of Sumy. Now we also have this problem as English speakers with the final letter E in Ukrainian words, such as in the Ukrainian town Rivne. It ends with a fairly open E sound. Now, that would technically be Rivne in English, but we never end words with an unstressed E. So as we adapted Sumy into Sumi, perhaps Rivne is the best we can do. As always, I welcome our Ukrainian friends to offer their input. Next to Luhansk is the region Kharkiv, whose capital city is also Kharkiv. Using the same principles we established above, we can anglicize this as Kharkiv. A famous city in Kharkiv Oblast is Izyum. This Y, sometimes written as an I, stands for the Y sound. Actually, it's the palatalization of the preceding consonant, but close enough. So in English, the right pronunciation of this city is Izyum. In the far west of the country is located the oblast and city of Lviv. It's pretty easy to anglicize. Lviv. Mykolaiv is an oblast adjacent to Kherson, and it has the Y for the I sound. So in English, it's Mykolaiv. Its major city is also Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv Oblast is next to Odessa. This city, along with the capital of the country of Ukraine, were well known in the English-speaking world for some time, but not in their Ukrainian form. Instead, the Russian forms of their names were transmitted to English through Polish and German and French. It's here I'd like to speak directly to Ukrainians about this matter. Let's take the English names of the Italian cities Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples. These hardly resemble their names in Italian: Milano, Venezia, Firenze, Roma, Napoli. Why is that? Well, the names Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples came into English via French, and French derived them ultimately from their names in medieval Latin. For the sake of simplicity, I will use the ecclesiastical pronunciation: Mediolanum, Venezia, Florencia, Roma, Neapolis. These medieval Latin names evolved with the French language, and English received a version of them. The fact that we call these places Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples is not to disrespect the Italian people. These are simply how we have received their names. This is also true for the historical spellings of Odessa and Kyiv, Odessa and Kiev. These names came to us not through direct contact with Russian, but via other European languages like French, German, and Polish. Due to the growing prestige of Ukraine, however, many English speakers now prefer the anglicized version of the Ukrainian names, Odessa and Kyiv. So I want you to know, українські друзі, that if you notice someone say or write Kiev or Odessa, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is trying to disrespect Ukraine or your beautiful language. Kiev, Odessa, Dnipro are all historical and entirely legitimate in the English language. And as they are indeed English words now, just like Milan, Rome, and Naples, it is ultimately up to English speakers to determine whether they want to adopt a different spelling or pronunciation. But to all my non-Ukrainian viewers, whether you're native speakers of English or not, it's important to recognize that English has a special status in the world today. Not only is it the first language of 370 million people, but it's the second language of 1 billion more, and it is the de facto international language. For this reason, Ukrainians take it as an expression of your respect for them if you use the anglicized forms of the Ukrainian place names rather than the Russian ones. Thus, I recommend you adopt the pronunciation and spellings Dnipro, Odessa, and Kyiv. For this reason, I also recommend ditching the in the old-fashioned expression the Ukraine. While the definite article itself doesn't convey anything pejorative, the term the Ukraine has now become inseparable from, shall we say, negative attitudes towards Ukraine and Ukrainians. I realize that old habits die hard, і мої українські друзі, keep that in mind too, but I do believe it is the better choice. Simply say, Ukraine. Now, I've talked about just a few Ukrainian places in order to give you an idea of how these names are to be rendered into English, but there are so many more. Since I didn't cover the majority of the places on this map, how can you figure out the right way to pronounce them in English? Well, I'll show you how to do that. This is what I do. Let's take this one. First, let's go to the Wikipedia page. Here's the name of this place, spelled in Ukrainian, and look, the pronunciation guide in the International Phonetic Alphabet, right next to it. Conveniently, the Ukrainian name has the stress accent, so we know that the second syllable is stressed in this word. But if that weren't there, the IPA, that is the International Phonetic Alphabet transcription, marks the stressed syllable by putting this tick mark before the syllable that carries the stress accent. But even better, there is a linked audio file we can listen to.
Чернігів.
But if that weren't there, we could copy the name in Ukrainian into Wiktionary. Wiktionary often has audio samples as well.
Чернігів.
If there's no audio file available, well, we can click right on the IPA, which takes us to, bam, the IPA symbols used in Ukrainian words, with tons of audio samples to help you learn them.
Aha.
Газета.
You can also learn IPA from these IPA videos I made. But if you're still lost, you can copy and paste the Ukrainian spelling into Google Translate. Make sure that Ukrainian is selected on the left and press the speaker icon.
Чернігів.
If you press it a second time, it'll play it a bit slower.
Чернігів.
Now we just have to apply the anglicization techniques I showed you above. Chair becomes chair or chur. Ni is like knee, the leg joint, and hiv is like heave. Chernihiv. I hope you found this video useful. If there are tricky place names in Ukraine that still aren't clear, let me know in the comments. To the Ukrainians in the audience, I very much welcome your feedback, especially if there are alternative English pronunciations you recommend. Thanks for liking the video and subscribing. Дуже дякую. Слава Україні!